Thanks very much. Let's take some questions.
Could you speak to the topic of bus rapid transit versus fixed transit?
Yes, and if I don't say enough about this, there's a lot of it on the blog. Just look at the category bus rapid transit. Bus rapid transit is what you get if you visualize something that has the speed, frequency, and reliability of mass, but that instead of being a vehicle on rails, is a vehicle on tires, on a road. There is no fundamental difference in the potential for speed, reliability, frequency, any of the real usefulness variables of transit. They do not vary with the bus versus rail distinction. They vary with what can get in your way, what kinds of speeds you've designed for, how frequently you stop. And those are the variables that really drive it. Now you can have an argument about whether those are the right variables that really drive ridership, and that's a different argument. But in terms of getting a particular degree of mobility out there, mobility that you would measure in a variable like how much of my city can I get to in an hour on transit, right? It makes sense to look at bus rapid transit from that perspective. The other important thing about bus rapid transit is that it is possible, if you have a bus rapid transit facility, for the buses in that facility to, when they get to the end, branch off and go directly to other places. This is why I think you're going to need to think about bus rapid transit when you start looking at Barbara, for example. Because when you get to the Portland city limits, the demand that's represented by the Barbara corridor starts spreading out. Part of it goes south toward 12 and Wilsonville, part of it goes southwest toward Tiger and Sherwood, part of it even goes west toward Washington Square. And all of that demand, which tends to come in and join into the sort of Barbara plus I-5 corridor at the Portland city limits. So I think it's going to be interesting. I don't have a position on this. I'm not recommending it as a solution, but I hope that there's going to be some interesting study of would a BRT facility going from in Barbara just out to the city limits after 65th Avenue, then with the potential for buses to run through to a number of other destinations in Washington and Clackamas counties, would that actually give you a better outcome than building a light rail line where, of course, once you get to the outer end, if you're not yet to where you're going to have to transfer to a bus? It's an interesting question.
What cities do you think have the best examples of BRT systems?
Brisbane, Australia, has the best developed world, wealthy, developed world BRT system in the world. It is the only one that is built to an extremely high standard where they're not only are you not sharing a lane with other vehicles, but you aren't even intersecting streets because almost the whole thing is grade separated. And if you look on my blog, I've written a lot about Brisbane and I've put in a lot of pictures of Brisbane. And that standard has some effects that you're probably not going to like often when it comes up to a really difficult, busy intersecting corridor, it goes aerial or it goes underground. It goes underground, which is expensive, or it goes aerial, which has huge visual impacts.
Well, so if you have that degree of separation from the road, then
right.
Where are the savings?
Well, there are some savings there are some savings in the fact that you're building a road instead of a rail line. There are considerable savings in the vehicles. Generally, one of the difficult things about this trade-off is that if you build a rail line, you're probably going to run fewer larger vehicles. And if you ride as a busway, you're going to run more smaller vehicles. But you're going to be getting other things from that, like the ability to branch them out and send them in several directions. So those are some of the issues. Yes, the Brisbane BRT, has been, not as expensive as light rail would have been, but I would say more than half as expensive, certainly, because they have built all of that structure, including, above all, the most important thing, which is the complete tunnel underneath downtown, which no other developed world city has done for a busway. Sorry, Chris.
At the risk of igniting a bus versus streetcar debate.
Oh, we have no need to do that.
I agree with you that the choice of rubber-tired vehicle versus rail at a certain level, a lot of the factors you mentioned, frequency, et cetera, absolutely equivalent. In local service, it seems to me that the streetcar has two factors that probably play at the level of psychology that are very real and very rational. One is that for the infrequent user, the rails tell you where the vehicle is going and creates improved confidence. The second is that if you're a developer, and part of the goal is placemaking as opposed to mobility, the sunk cost in the rails is a commitment to future service and therefore people going past your building. Seems to me that takes some of the equivalence between the two choices out of the equation.
Let's try to locate those statements on this hierarchy.
Okay.
A statement that people will interpret rails in the street as indicating permanence is a statement about, it's actually a statement about the efficacy of something as a symbol for something else. It's a linguistic statement. It really belongs at the level somewhere between psychology and culture. There is, as you know, a technical objection to streetcars in mixed traffic, which is that things happen in traffic lanes and buses can go around them and streetcars can't. That is geometry. Now, you can decide that we understand and accept that risk and understand that that is going to be a downside of running streetcars in mixed traffic, but it's not what the buses would do. You can decide that, but have that conscious conversation and decide that consciously. I'm not completely sure that the original Portland streetcar debate, which I followed as editor at the time, really had that conversation. And I talked to a lot of people who, now and then, to people who were really attracted to the streetcar because they thought it was going to be something like Max. No, it's not. It's a mixed traffic. That's a different set of priorities. It's a different consequence for mobility. So that's the outline, basically, of the whole streetcar debate that you can find going on and on and on the blog. Just look up the category streetcars trams. You can miss probably several days worth of reading there. But it's interesting. And Chris has some good comments. Who was next? Who's Henry? Yeah, ma'am.
A couple of other things I'd like to hear you address regarding streetcar or light rail and BRT are operational costs, if
Right.
the buses are smaller, and also fuel.
Mm-hmm. And emissions.
Yeah.
If you want to do a proper bus versus rail calculation that looks at emissions impacts, and if you decide that's important, you really have to compare light rail with trolley buses, because there is an electric alternative for buses. Operations cost, you're absolutely right that if we run more smaller vehicles, we're going to have a higher operations cost, because operations cost is driven primarily by labor. In the wealthy world, in the developing world, it's different. But a lot of that has to do with what's the particular need in the corridor you're looking at. How much feeder bus service would we have to run anyway, even if we were just connecting with light rail? And then also, that has to be weighed against what are the ridership advantages of not requiring that transfer at the end of the light rail line to get to other places in the area. So those are some of the calculations that go into it in any particular light rail study. And this is a good example of why there's a multi-stage conversation between the goals and the expertise. You start out with some grand goals. Your planners go off and draw you up 7 possible alternatives for your corridor. You look at that and think, oh wow, I guess I didn't really mean that goal. This is actually now that you've done it, this one's actually motivating me more. And so you have that kind of conversation. That's how a good process works. Sir?
Do you think some of the issues with BRT in America is funding sources and educating Congress and people who provide funding in rail projects versus BRT?
I think that what the Bush FTA called BRT may very well have destroyed the usefulness of that term, because they called anything BRT that was, a bus painted nice and stopping us all. Right? And they did that because they wanted to appear to be funding a lot of transit without actually spending a lot of money. That's a challenge now for the FTA in this country to find a way out of that. My perspective as an international blogger, having lots of readers outside the U.S., I'm always interested that the trauma that I hear from American activists surrounding the term BRT doesn't seem to exist in other countries very much. Certainly not in Australia and New Zealand. There seems to be a much calmer conversation about it. So I do think there's clearly trauma around the word here because of what it meant in the Bush administration, and I think we're still waiting for that word to be reinvented in a more positive way. Yeah, it's unfortunate that there's nowhere in North America you can go to see something as good as Brisbane. And so, by all means, if you're ever planning a vacation to Australia, do go to Brisbane and do Quarrels. Others? Certainly.
I'm curious if you've really thought about how automobile subsidies and policies that encourage that effect. I mean, if you want to use that chart there, I see it as people are discouraged from using transit, so they might have a feeling, as you said, I don't have to use buses or whatever, And so the issue I really see is that transit kind of starts at a disadvantage. So you really have to, it means you have to more go for their feelings. You know?
If you're trying to imagine that the world is experiencing what Wendell Cox would say, which is the world is experiencing a valid competition between public transit and cars are winning, and so we should go with cars. No, obviously, it's a highly imbalanced, unfair competition because of the degree to which cars are invisibly subsidized. I don't probably spend as much time saying that as some people do, mostly because I think lots of people are saying that, and I think you don't need to be a transit planner to figure that out. Any decent economist can understand that issue and the nature of that subsidy. Yeah.
The bottom line is I see that if people, if this were a real marketplace, a lot of these issues might not happen because people would be it wouldn't matter what their feeling was. They would realize that transit, even if it's a bus, is the best way to go, and you win.
That's an important point. You know, in any kind of public outreach process, you'll see lots of opportunities for people to express their feelings, and that's really important. But in the real world, our feelings interact with our sense with what's possible. We would all love to have a nice, spacious seat on an airplane with, 5 kinds of wine, but that's not what the market is settling on. Because when people actually take that feeling and compare it and look at the other things it means, numerically, they decide that they're going to live without that feeling, or that they're just going to live without that need being met. So that's why I think always asking just about what people think. Stated preference surveys, for example, what would you do if, or what do you generally like, is just not very helpful. You over here?
Yeah, you seem to suggest that personal rapid transit comes from feelings or emotions. Does that mean it's technically not feasible, or what are your thoughts about that?
It's technically feasible. No one can figure out how it's economically feasible. It has 2 problems. Well, first of all, personal rapid transit is the notion that over every significant street in our city will have a little monorail-like viaduct with little pod-like cars moving along it. And we'll be able to go out from this building, and there'll be a little queue of those cars waiting for us. And we'll get in there, and all by ourselves, without having to ride with strangers. That's the key selling point. Without having to get a vehicle with strangers, we will be whisked through the system to our destination station. It's technically possible. Lots of things are technically possible. Nobody can figure out why given how difficult it is to build an elevated anything, a city is supposed to embrace a whole lot of the density of viaducts that BRT requires. Nobody can really figure out how it is that this thing is going to be really an efficient use of resources when clearly so much is being spent on the goal of protecting people from having to ride a vehicle with strangers. And I don't feel it's bad to have to ride a vehicle with strangers. And so there's surely a culture that had that overwhelming message. We don't trust each other, we don't want to ride with strangers, we don't want to be around strangers. Would end up, and if that were the overriding issue, if you decided it was fundamental to your psychology or your biology, you could run over all the technical objections and build personal rapid transit. Doesn't seem to be happening. Personal rapid transit is also a nice example of, it works really well, like Arcasante. It'll be great when it's finished. But it's very hard to visualize the intervening steps and how each one of those intervening steps is also a viable network and a viable investment. So those are just some of the issues in terms of my own quick reaction. We are on 1 o'clock.
Well, thank you. Tell them your website again.
Human transit.org. It's right there. So thanks very much for your time.